I'm really honored to be able to speak to you today. And I've been asked to speak on Indigenous rights. And I want to tell you is that nobody gets educated about Indigenous and treaty rights or Indigenous peoples in Canada. And even 40 years after I was involved in a textbook survey on Indigenous people, in Canada, we're only starting to implement that into school curriculums. And people are only just starting to recognize that there's some valued history. Welcome to Chief Dry Geese Land, the Acacia Territory in the Northwest Territories. Many people don't know about Indigenous rights. It wasn't in the systems. Very few people understand what treaties are. Treaties are international agreements. They were ensconced in law or encased in law in the late 1500s. And cynically, what you can say is that is when people started crossing the seas and moving into other people's territories, that they passed international laws on treaties respecting Indigenous people only for their own purposes, protect the thefts that they did from each other as European and colonial nations. So treaties come from the 1500s and were implemented in Canada, in areas like Canada, under the British Proclamation of 1763. So treaties are not, they're only signed between sovereign nations. They are not signed between the federal government and the provincial government. They are not signed between provinces and municipalities. They are only signed between sovereign nations. And that's an important thing to know, because there are a lot of people that are hired, and they have been hired by previous governments to come up here and talk to people that are not Indigenous to say that there is no such thing as treaty rights. There's no such thing as Indigenous rights. And only a few years ago, Mr. Tom Flanagan, hired by the Harper government, was up here making a speech at the Explorer Hotel to say there's no such thing as Indigenous and treaty rights. And there are many groups that are operating down south. One of them is called the Committee to Stop Racial Legislation or Racial Laws. And they're pretty active on Facebook. Basically, what they're trying to do is get rid of the Indian Act, but not only that. The Indian Act is a real cynical implementation of treaty rights, and it's been a horrible act for people. However, the people need to be involved in changes, any changes, because sovereign nations have the right to determine citizenship. So that is not... Thank you. So the Indian Act itself has been a dreadful piece of legislation, but the treaty, the right to citizenship, the right to determine governance authorities is within treaty empowerment. Okay, so one of the, just some of the things that I don't think that people knew and what has happened with Indigenous people in Canada, but how people in the Northwest Territories really changed that. In Canada, if you lived in a community of 8,000 more, you could demand that the government remove all First Nations people from your community and set up reserves. And so that is what happened actually in the Northwest Territories. People demanded a reserve, and now you have the settlement of data. And then later on, DILO, but DILO was really, really ignored for a long time until they properly got funding to properly deal with governance issues that they do now. There are other things. I mean, you had to have passes to get off the reserve. You had to have them signed off. An Indian agent could take away the status of a First Nation woman at any time for any reason, and it happened. If you lost your status, you lost your community, you were no longer able to live on the reserve. Returning veterans from the First World War. The First World War, First Nations people did a higher per capita people of signing up and enlistment than any other group of Canadians. The First Nations did. And when they...
If you marry non-Aboriginal.
Oh, absolutely. If you married, yeah, if you married non-Indigenous men, you lost your status and you were kicked off the reserve. Just to get back to the veterans, if you served in the wars and came back and tried to get your veterans benefits, like entitled to every other soldier, you lost your benefits. You lost your First Nation status. If you became an engineer, a lawyer, a surveyor, a minister, a priest, you were deemed, hey, smart enough to be enfranchised, and you lost your status and your community. So there's just an incredible, horrible history of the implementation of the Indian Act and the push by the federal government to get as many people off rolls as First Nations people. Okay, the Métis were promised land. They signed script. It was never ever implemented. It was not honored by provinces. They were not honored by municipalities. And so Métis people, in the end, lived on what they called federal reserve places. They were called the railway people because the only places that they could stay and build little houses was on CN and CP tracts of land, federal lands. And the Inuit were basically, we don't want to build another class of people, so we're not doing it. They're just not going to be there. So the Inuit have been trying to get recognition all these years with special protections, special legislations to deal. Now, one of the things that happened in the Northwest Territories is that the government of the day wanted to have the reserve system move up so everybody would be put in their place, away, out of sight, out of mind. It was the Indian Brotherhood of the Northwest Territories, the Métis Association together, but the Indian Brotherhood with Francois Paulette and all of the chiefs signed a caveat which was served on the government of Canada to control 100,000 square miles of land in the Northwest Territories. That was done in 1973, and it actually went through the first level of the Supreme Court of the Northwest Territories, went to the Court of Appeal. It was dropped at that point because the federal government decided that they were going to negotiate and that there was going to be a new way of dealing with Indigenous rights in the Northwest Territories. And so the Northwest Territories and BC actually are leaders internationally when it comes down to the legal fight and going in front of the Federal Court of Canada and dealing with actions concerning Indigenous rights, citizenship, membership, land rights, protection of waters, protection of children. All of those rights that you take for granted are things that have had to have been fought on a pace by interest, by rights based. Every inch has been fought for by Indigenous people. But you should and take pride in the fact that Indigenous people also being relegated to the farthermost corners of Canada now are your protectors of your headwaters for your water, your rivers, your lakes in Canada. They're the ones who are going to safeguard. They will safeguard the future of our water in Canada because it is under attack. When companies like Nestle's can come in and literally purchase water rights so that you have to buy it. You have to buy.
Water is life.
It's life. Water is life. And so actions such as this. So what we're asking, of course, I'm getting over my 3 and 4 minutes because what we're asking is that people understand education. Try and educate yourself. If you don't know something, ask somebody. Read. Find good reading materials. There's an excellent source of the things that I've said. With respect to the old Indian Act, it's all in a book by Sharon Van, who talked about all of the changes that happened under the Indian Act. And so those kinds of things, you can see the kind of struggles that people have been dealing with. And you see people, so when you look at somebody who's homeless on the street, especially in front of the post office, remember, they are a member of a group, have been marginalized. They have been marginalized in every shape and form of life that you can even consider on your day-to-day existence, that they no longer and don't have the right to control. So just remember that when you're talking with people, and look to people that are bringing up attitudes and saying, well, why don't you just set up a reserve? That was the big question in the 70s. Well, why don't you people get onto reserves? It'll be so nice. You'll have your lives all organized. No. And people were smart enough here to know about that. But remember, protectors of headwaters, protectors of land, protectors of our future. That is the important thing. So when you I always love the one thing, when you're looking at land and you're looking at water, thank an Indian. All right, enough. I know everybody wants coffee.
Thank you so much, Gail.
All right, okay. I've got one bad knee, so I have to be careful. Okay, thank you. Oh, and one last thing. It was illegal for Canadian lawyers to work for First Nations until the early 1960s. 1962, that changed.